Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 6. Today we'll be talking about security technologies including access controls, firewalls, and virtual private networks. By the end of this chapter, we should be able to discuss the important role of access control as well as identify and discuss widely used authentication factors within access controls. We should also be able to describe firewall technologies, including what firewall is and the different implementations approach for firewalls. At the end, we should be able to discuss remote connections, dial-ups, as well as virtual private networks implementations, and how remote connections are secured within organizations, as well as how clients systems connect with server systems remotely and securely. So a bit of an introduction. This chapter falls within the technical control that we highlighted at the beginning of the semester. We did mention there are management controls, operational controls, and technical controls. These are part of the technical implementations that needs to be done on either um, systems, networks, pretty much organizations need to implement these to ensure security from a technical viewpoint. Technical control solutions, when properly implemented, pretty much improve an organization's ability to balance the objectives of the organizations as well as making information readily available and accessible whenever needed. To begin with, we are going to talk about access controls, which is a method by which systems determine whether and how to admit a user into a trusted area of the organization or of the system or whatever the subject is trying to access, basically the object. We do have different model and approach to implementing access controls. To begin with, we have the mandatory access control, discretionary access control, and also the non-discretionary access control. Mandatory access control uses data classification schemes such as what the military use, and the implementation is actually more along the lines of defense and DoD. It, It's a required structured data classification scheme that rates each collection of information as well as each user. So basically, within mandatory access control is where you find things like top secret, secret, or even confidential. Users do not really have much freedom to determine who has access to their files, but rather the clearance of that object or the file will determine who is going to have access based on the clearance of the individual subject as well. So an example is if a data or a file or anything has been classified and has a security label of top secret, then an individual must be vetted and cleared to access top secret information. So basically access using mandatory access control requires a cleared user to access a certain classification of data. Next, we have the discretionary access control. Discretionary access control allow users to control and pretty much provide access to information at their disposal. So this is where an information or system owner or data owner will give access based on their discretion and determine who should have access, not really necessarily based on need to know, but just because they own the data at their discretion. It's controlled by the user as well as the owner of the data. To summarize a bit, pretty much the data owner determines who can access pretty much specific resources, files, or whatever it is that they own. As well, I mean, a system administrator may create some sort of a hierarchy of the files to be accessed based on types of permission, but at the end of the day, still the system owner or data owner with respect to discretionary access control will be the one to grant the rights as well as approval for the information to be accessed. Then we have the non-discretionary access control, or pretty much role-based access control as well. And role-based access controls allow access to data based on the job title. They largely eliminate pretty much discretion when providing access to objects. That is, there's nothing like a discretionary access approval by the system or data owner just because they feel like it, but rather access is given based on the role. An example of this is maybe someone from HR should not have a permission to create network accounts because they have nothing to do with network administration or even system administration. Rather, someone from HR should have access to HR files. Same thing for someone for a system administrator or network administrator, they should not have access to employee records. That is more of a HR um, duties, and the access control should be limited to someone within HR. This is a type of role-based access control. And as you go down in the list or within the role-based access control, also like the non-discretionary, which is really the controls that are controlled by the organization. Access controls that are controlled by the organization, basically defined by policy or some sort of a job function, like we mentioned for HR and the system admin, but that it's not really at the discretion of the user, but rather there is something in place that determines how the information is going to be accessed, and that is controlled by the organization. Now, based on that, you'll find there are a lot of other access controls, such as attribute-based access control. We have the history-based access control as well, including identity-based access control. In identity-based access control, this is more of like how a network admin can more effectively manage activity and access based on individual needs rather than just putting it all together. They will just provide it based on individual needs. We also have the organizational based access control that allows like the policy designer to kind of define the security policy independently of the implementation. And last, we have the rule based access control. And the rule-based access control is largely context-based, I would say, because an example of this will be allowing students to use the lab during a certain day of time if we're talking about real life. But with rule-based access control, certain conditions must be met before access is granted. That is, maybe we could say, well, students will not be able to get into the lab without having their badge. The rule is having the badge, and then the access control will be maybe they have to scan it to identify themselves, and once they identify themselves using the badge, then they can get access to it. And pretty much these are the high level access control models. Organizations can define and decide how access control is within their organizations, but each single access control might fall within one of the first three, either mandatory, discretionary, or a role-based access control. Now we have certain mechanisms. Pretty much these are the mechanisms that access control rely on to pretty much identify as well as authenticate, authorize, and account for access control systems. They are considered the four fundamental functions of each of every access control system. An abbreviation of this is just the IAAA. These are the identification. These are the identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. Now, if you want to pretty much map it to kind of understand it on an easier format for yourself, I will say identification is more like I am the user of the system. So I'm identifying myself to the system that, hey, I'm a user of the system. Authentication is me proving that, yes, indeed, I am the user of that system. And authorization is pretty much, okay, I am the user of the system. I have proved that I am the user of the system, but what am I allowed to do within the system? That is part of authorization. And accountability has to do more with, okay, now that we have identified, authenticate, and authorize me to carry out a certain function within the system, something should track and monitor that I do exactly what I am allowed or authorized to do on the system. And we'll go in depth on the subsequent chapters for each of these. Identification, like I mentioned, this is pretty much a mechanism whereby unverified entities seeking access to a system must provide some sort of a label or identifier in which they are known to the system. So basically, if I'm accessing a system and I have a username and a password, maybe my identifier is I was zero junior. And every organization as well as every system has a way that it understands has its own way of format, pretty much a unique information that should be used to identify any subject. Now, it's quite important in our system that the identification be unique for each single subject, as well as pretty much for each single user. If we have a system where there is I was zero junior and then there is another I was zero junior, then identification might be an issue because we have two identifiers and it will be hard to differentiate which one is me and which one is the other person. Some organizations generate random numbers, including timestamps, considering when you think of date and timestamps, each single second happens once. So there will be no Sunday, June 14th, actually June 16th at maybe 5:30 p.m. 23 seconds. That will only happen once, and you'll find a lot of organizations using timestamps or something like that to generate an identifier. Also, identifiers pretty much have everything in terms of, can have anything in terms of what is being used as the identifiers, including concatenating, like maybe just first name initial and the last name, like I did here, an example with my name. And some systems might just use random numbers, some might use special keys. You find this a lot in school where students have their names along with some random numbers attached to it, and the instructors have their first initial and just the last name. So if I were a student, mine might be I was zero junior 001 or maybe 5253. I never make sense of those numbers, never paid attention to what they actually really mean. But yeah, you find that with some numbers and then add the school.edu, and considering I'm an instructor, you see mine as just I was zero junior at school.edu. And that's pretty much the uh, identification step. And then the next we have the authentication. So now that the system has identified me that yes, this is indeed the person who pretty much the system has been able to identify me as the person who can have access to this system, there is a need to authenticate that individual or that subject within the system. Now, the authentication requires validating a user's identity, and one of the ways to validate as well as to authenticate that same user is based on the three authentication factors: something you know, something you are and something you have. Now, a combination of these two is what we refer to as two-factor authentication, and it's always the best implementation approach to for you to always have some sort of a two-factor authentication in place. That way, it will, because each of these have their own form of vulnerability. However, having two of these in place minimizes the risk of uh, someone getting access to the system and and maybe actually claiming to be you by authenticating. Especially with passwords, we all know that passwords brute force is kind of a bit easy. We touched on this a little bit on chapter 2, and then also something you have could be a smart key, key card, or physical key, or anything like that. It's also very easy to be stolen, where people can just take it. And then something you are, it could be fingerprint, um, as well as biometrics. We've seen it on extreme levels in movies where someone's finger is chopped off just to gain access, or his ball sockets. I mean, don't want to scare people, but yeah, it's in place. Also, another vulnerability of something you are is could be your phone, where you use fingerprints to authenticate. There are a lot of cases where people are just sleeping, and then another person will just pick up the phone and pretty much put their thumb on it without them knowing. So these are all vulnerabilities. However, putting two of these together is kind of hard, where if you have a password and a biometric, it requires an additional step. Well, to go in detail for each of these, something you know will classify as maybe a password or anything like a private word or combination of characters that only the user knows. It could also be a passphrase, maybe a series of characters, or maybe a sentence. Whatever is stored in memory, the individual's memory is considered something you know. Something you are, these are pretty much it depends on the characteristics of the individual. Could be a facial expression, facial geometry, hand geometry, palm, fingerprint, iris, including retina recognition. People are really sensitive to the eye biometric thing, but that's all part of something you are. It's considered one of the strong authentication, especially considering the fact that each individual have their own unique biometrics characteristics. Then we also have the something you have that is something in your possession, kind of a key, or maybe a thumb drive, a smart card, could be a PIF card, your CAC card. I mean, a lot of things. If you write down your password just to memorize it and then put it in a paper and fold it, that falls under something you have. However, just know that it can still be brute forced. But actually, it doesn't fall under something you have. While you have the paper, the content of the paper is stamped to memory, because the paper that you've written the password cannot be used to authenticate. However, if you have a key and that key is used to unlock, then that falls under something you have. Biometrics is considered the strong authentication, and it's basically because of it has to do with human characteristics, and every individual, at least when it comes to fingerprints, hand geometry, facial geometry, tends to have their own unique characteristics. For biometrics, they are usually evaluated based on false reject rate, false accept rate, and crossover rate. False reject rate is pretty much when the system is kind of hard to authenticate. Uh, let's say I have my fingerprint, and that is pretty much my password on my iPhone or Android or whatsoever, but I have a fingerprint, and that is my authentication mechanism. And it's really hard for the system to authenticate me because of maybe sweaty hands, because of whatsoever. Maybe you find instances where you have to do it multiple times to unlock you. That means that the system has a high false reject rate because it keeps rejecting me even though I am the authorized user. And then we have instances where maybe the system is not that sensitive and it's been calibrated to just for ease access, and you find even the little thing the system will have a false acceptance rate, maybe not really a facial expression but just a facial recognition where maybe I kind of need to authenticate my phone with my face, but then someone is able to get my picture and kind of just show the picture to the phone, but the phone will not be able to pick that human characteristics in terms of motion and whatsoever, and is still able to authenticate that user with a picture. That is a false acceptance rate. Now, when it comes to biometrics, pretty much depending on the need, but the preferred implementation is to have the what we refer to as the crossover rate. That is a balance between the false reject rate as well as the false acceptance rate. That is what we refer to as the CER, and that is usually considered a perfect calibration for biometrics as well as pretty much, yeah, biometrics. Now, like I mentioned, it depends on the need and it depends on the requirements of the organization. There are organizations that might actually prefer to have a false reject. I highly doubt of a false accept rate, but it's possible. And yeah, biometrics, like I mentioned multiple times, they are really reliable and effective. At least that's what they are considered, and they are considered are often considered intrusive by users. And this is pretty much kind of a ranking of effectiveness of which part of biometrics is considered really great when it comes to university uniqueness, permanence, collectability, and all of that. So if you're using your face when it comes to the collectability, is considered high, but the performance is low and the acceptance is high. This is just a chart to pretty much show the ranking of the different aspects of biometrics that we you often use when you get the chance, or I think you should pause the system, kind of familiarize yourself with this, just have a good idea of what is what and which implementation is the most effective regarding effectiveness and acceptance. Next, we have the authorization, and authorization is pretty much matching of an authenticated user to a list of information, asset, or pretty much corresponding access level. And this basically means, okay, now that I've been authenticated on the system, what am I allowed to access on the system? Do I have pretty much admin access to the entire system, which means I can do everything? Or or do I have only limited access to only certain files and certain sections of the system, or rather certain parts of the system? What can I do, including my functions and everything? That's all falls under the authorization. And yes, a typical example will be a regular user will identify themselves, they will authenticate as well using either a password, biometric, or whatsoever. But because they do not own the system and they do not have administrative privilege on the system, they might not be able to delete files or even edit files. Or they might not be able to download. A lot of things can be limited based on, can be decided based on the authorization. Now, authorization can be handled usually in three ways. That is authorization for each authenticated user, authorization for a member of a group, or authorization across multiple systems. Authorization for each authenticated user means that the system admin or whoever is given that authorization will define that authorization based on the individual user. That is, each single identifier on the system will have their own limitation or privileges or whatever it is, but their access level will be defined at the user level. Authorization for members of a group, and you find this group implementation is really much easier for sysadmins to manage and maintain rather than give each single individual user rather than define for each single user, they just add a user to a group and then define the access level at the group level. An example of this will be, let's say, people in HR should not have access to the network files, and there are like 100 people in HR. Rather than just keep going on to each single individual and deciding like, okay, this individual should not have access to this file, this file, this file, and defining all the files, what a good sysadmin will do is create a group and say that every single individual that falls within this group shall not have access to these files, the network files we mentioned, and all the HR members will be added to that HR group that was created with limitations to those network file access. And then there is also authorization across multiple systems where you find a single user. This includes things like SSO, single sign-on, and all of that. But a single user has been identified and authenticated on one system, but they can also access another system based on the access they already got from one system. I mean, all of these falls under different types of, like I mentioned earlier, different types of authorization mechanisms, be it authorization credentials or maybe authorization tickets. They are usually issued by an authenticator, and pretty much when it comes to authorization across multiple systems, you find like one system authorizes the individual and issues them a credential or a ticket or whatsoever, or some sort of a token, and using that token they will be able to access other systems. Lately we are seeing a lot of these implementations coming up. It makes it easier to manage things especially with IAM implementations, that's identity and access management implementation. Lately, a lot of single sign-on implementations are going on. Makes it easier to handle as well as easier to remove a user and all of that. Next, we have the accountability, and this is after everything has happened. A user has been identified, has been um, authorized, and everything. Then the next thing is pretty much to ac- pretty much account for the user's action. That is auditability of the user. That is to ensure that every single thing the user does on the system, authorized or unauthorized, it's pretty much mapped to a to that same user. So if somehow a HR person were able to access network files and they weren't authorized to access that, the system should be able to account for that. That is when viewing whatever is holding the record should show that, okay, this user accessed this, sorry, this user with certain identifier has accessed these files, and the good implementation shows a good accountability implementation, that is same thing as audit implementation, should have, oh, should be able to capture the identifier, that is who the user is, what is being accessed, that is like the network files, what time, when, where, a lot of things can be captured. Usually these records are stored in different um, types of records, but they are what we refer to as logs. There could be system logs, file logs, and pretty much logs have many uses. And every organization, depending on their need, can decide what type of logs they want to capture. Now that we understand the IAAA, we are going to talk about different architecture models. And when we say architecture models, these are basically the access control implementation that can help organizations quickly make improvements. And we have a lot of architectures in place, going back all the way to the early 70s, 80s, and 90s. And as time goes on, all these models are being improved, as well as we are identifying different needs and loopholes, closing loopholes, coming up with newer architectures that are much better. First, we are going to start with the TCP, referred to as the Trusted Computing Base. The TCP is part of the Trusted Computer Systems Evaluation Criteria. If you could remember in the first chapter, we mentioned a guidelines that was created by DoD sometimes in the late 80s or early 90s. It was created by U.S. Department of Defense, and it provides a guideline for how computer systems should be evaluated as well as secured. It is also referred to as Rainbow Series, and it is used to enforce security policy through system configuration. And some of the biggest challenge that was identified with the TCB is pretty much covert channels, including storage channels and timing channels. We also have the international set of criteria for evaluating computer systems, that is the ITSEC. And the ITSEC is the European version of the TCSEC, and that is pretty much the guideline that compares targets of evaluation to detailed security function specification. Now, the TCSCC has been replaced by the common criteria, and the common criteria, I believe, has an ISO as well as IEC. ISO, that's the standard, international standard organization, and the IEC, that's International Electrotechnical Commission. It has a number of 15408 or 048. Okay. And pretty much the common criteria, like the other two, the TCSEC and ITSEC, it's a framework in which computer system users can specify their security functions and pretty much assurance requirements. It is considered the successor of both the TCSE SEC as well as the ITSEC. These are all pretty much guidelines that we don't really use these days. Then we have the Bella Padula confidentiality model, which is also used by the US government and pretty much the military. I believe it is also developed by DoD. But the Bella Padula describe a set of access control rules which use security labels on objects and clearances for subjects. So, like we were talking about like we were talking about earlier around mandatory access control. Bella Padula, what it does is it defines security based on security clearances and security labels. So every single object that is the data or resource that is being accessed must have a label that says it is top secret, confidential, or even public, that is unclassified information. And the users, that's the subjects that are going to access that object with security labels, must be cleared to access the subject, and the individuals will be cleared either at the top secret level, confidentiality level, and there's nothing for unclassified. There is no clearance for unclassified information or even a classified. There is no category for public information. However, there is something called a public trust, which is for information that are considered unclassified but sensitive. An individual requires to have a public trust, and public trust just basically means that one behaves in a good way, there are no issues, and the government or whoever is giving you access trusts you just as a regular public, at the regular public level. And yeah, pretty much you are a good person, I guess, and then you'll get a public trust, and you'll be able to access information that is unclassified but sensitive. Um, With Bella Padula, we have something referred to as because it deals with confidentiality. If you remember, we did discuss confidentiality, integrity, and availability CIA beginning this class, and each single one is important towards the data or whatever object is being protected. Now, Bella Padula model, it's really strong when it comes to protecting confidentiality of an information rather than the integrity. And as such, because confidentiality is being protected, an individual or whoever the subject is will not be able to read up or write down. What that means is someone who has maybe a secret clearance will not be able to read up. That is, they cannot read any information at the top secret level. And they will also not be able to write down, which means they will not be able to write at anything below top secret. And to elaborate a little bit on that, the right aspect, hypothetically speaking, let's say they are working on a secret information, and write down means they are coming below secret classification, maybe just confidential classification. Their ability to write at confidential classification, even though they are working on secret, means that there could be a data spill. That means they might mistakenly write something at a lower level that is lower than secret, which means something is going out and when it's not supposed to be. And it also means that someone who has no secret clearance but has a confidential has someone who has no secret clearance but has a lower level clearance will be able to access and read that information that was written down, even though it is meant for a secret level. Um, and next we have the Biba integrity model, similar to Bellapagula, but this focused more on integrity, and as such, it does not allow to write up and you cannot read down. So write up meaning someone at the secret level cannot write up to classify to top secret level, because writing up to top secret level will affect the integrity of that information, and they will not be able to read down because they are not allowed to see anything beyond the secret level. And this focus more on the integrity aspect. Now, if you remember, integrity the integrity of data pretty much should every data that has so data integrity goals pretty much rely around preventing data modification by unauthorized individuals, so only authorized individuals to be able to modify the data, also preventing unauthorized data modification by authorized parties. So there is a difference between the earlier one that I mentioned, that is preventing data modification by unauthorized users. In this case, it means the subject is not authorized to pretty much modify the object. When we talk about preventing unauthorized data modification by authorized party, it means the subject as well is already authorized to have access to that data and everything, but they are still not allowed to modify the data. Then I guess part of data integrity goals also include maintaining internal and external consistency of the data. So that is, the data should reflect and definitely accurately represent what it is truly it is. We also have the Clark-Wilson also focus on integrity, like the Biba integrity model. It also doesn't allow change by unauthorized subjects, as discussed earlier. Also doesn't allow unauthorized changes by authorized subjects, and maintaining data consistency internally and externally is also needed with Clark-Wilson integrity model. We have what we refer to as um, the Graham Denning access control model, which pretty much composes of set of objects, set of subject, and set of rights. This is where you see the subjects and objects have a certain right before access is granted, and those rights must be mapped with each other before access is granted. And there are other models that we don't really talk about that much. We have another one called the Harrison Russo Ullman, I believe. And then there is also the Brewer Nash model. Brewer Nash is actually a bit popular. It's also called the Chinese wall. And what it does, it's separation of duties. If you have ever seen anything called as an SOD matrix, then it's following the Brewer Nash model. But basically, what it does is to prevent conflict of interest between two parties. Now that we understand pretty much access control, we are going to look into the devices that pretty much enable access control to be implemented. And for that, we are going to look at a firewall device operating at a network level because nothing really, because a firewall is actually the biggest device that is being used to maintain access in and out of a network. Every organization should have a firewall. If they have their own internal network, then they should have some sort of a firewall. I mean, these days there are a lot of routers that function like firewalls, but having a dedicated appliance, at least at the organizational level, is really advised. A firewall is a combination of hardware and software that pretty much filters traffic. And what it does, is think of a barrier between the internal and external connection. If you have taken my IT 520 class, you should understand public IPs and private IPs, and you should understand NATing, that's network address translation, where where the IP's addresses change. That should be considered your boundary. Ideally, you will want to have a firewall either right after the router or right before the router, and all of these depends on, well, your architecture, the network architecture and network setup. Um, an example will be if the router belongs to the service provider, then it will be much more advised to have the firewall after the router on the network when we look at it from the outside. And if the router is owned by the organization itself, then ideally the firewall should go before the router when we look at it from outside. And if, yeah, we have different pretty much processing modes of uh, firewalls. But before I get into the processing modes, I would like to add a little bit. A firewall should be able to separate either a computer system or network, as well as if it's operating at the application, if it's an application firewall within a host system, then it should be able to separate software services running. And at the network level, at least it should be able to separate between external and internal networks. And it should pretty much be right at the gateway of wherever it needs to be separated. The different firewall processing modes that we have include packet filtering, application layer proxy, that is pretty much application gateways. We also have the MAC layer firewalls and the hybrid processing pretty much mode that includes having one or two, pretty much two or three of the processing modes. A little recap on networking. If you have taken my IT class IT 520, you should be familiar with this. If you haven't, actually, this class is a prerequisite for IT 520. So I highly advise that if you haven't taken the IT 520, then you should familiarize yourself with some of the contents to enable you really understand how a firewall functions. And a little recap if around network layers and network models. IT 520 is mostly on TCPIP. That is the four layers that we have by at the far right here, including application, the host, internet, layer as well as the subnet. However, the TCP/IP layers are all based on the OSI module, and the OSI module will have several layers starting from top to bottom. We have application presentation session, which are all considered application layer at the TCP/IP. We also have the transport and network, which are considered. We have the transport, which is considered also a transport layer at the TCP/IP. We have the network called the internet. Some call it network, but basically network and internet are kind of the same thing. Um, well, not really the same thing, but network is internet is a network on a global scale. We also have the layer two and layer one devices. Layer two and layer one, that's the data link and physical layer, which are also the subnet layers at the TCP/IP. As you can see in between, there is the included protocols, and it just means these are the different types of protocols that function at the different layers. We have like the simple network mail transfer protocol. Sorry, we have the SNMP protocol, we have the file transfer protocol, TFT, Telnet, and all those different protocols. We also have the simple mail transfer protocol, that's the SMTP, that enables email exchange. At the transport layer, we have the UDP and TCP, TCP reliable, UDP unreliable. If you've taken the class, you should definitely remember this. If you haven't taken the class, I highly recommend that you take it and understand TCP/IP, especially the transport layer, really important when it comes to networking and pretty much the entire internet. We have the network and internet layer, which deals with IP. That's the internet protocol. Just IP addresses and everything falls all falls within the IP layer. We also have the network interface cards, also referred to as NIC. We also have the transmission media, which could be coaxial cable, wireless, fiber, optics, and all of that. As you can see, looking at the TCP/IP layers, application layer, it only makes sense that application layer firewalls operate at the application layer, which means that they filter traffic based on the protocols that are within the application layer. An example of this will be, let's take SMTP, for example. SMTP is the protocol that enables the user to send and receive emails. If one is using an application layer protocol, it means they can block and they can deny as well as allow traffic to go into the network or out of the network by configuring the SMTP protocol to allow or deny. Now, when we come down, you'll see the SPI firewalls. This is a different type of firewall also that operates at the transport layer. What basically it's saying is that the firewall operating at the transport layer will not be able to have application layer implementation. So you cannot implement SMTP when using SPI firewalls. Rather, you will block traffic based on TCP or UDP. When you come down to the packet filtering firewall, it only does that based on IP addresses. So you can only block IP addresses, not really the protocol, not really the application protocol, or even the transport protocol. And then we have the MAC firewall, which pretty much block the entire device, not just the IP address. If you remember that from also the IT520 class, every single device must have a MAC address that is associated to its network interface card. That MAC address can be filtered. And by the right, we just have pretty much a representation of what is included in this. Is actually more of IP layer and just headers, tab of service, and everything. Just an in-depth breakdown of protocols. We have the data, we have the options. That is just additions of things, including the header aspect, which has the destination, source IP protocol, header checksum, and all of those characteristics that needs to be added at the header, which will allow that to be encapsulated with the data so that it can travel within the network. Now, to look in depth at the packet filter firewalls, they, like I mentioned earlier, they examine the header of data packets, which is they look at the application layer protocol, and they are often based on a combination of based on a combination of This is the packet filter firewall, not the application firewall. So they do not look at the application layer protocols, but rather they do look at the packet layer protocol. The packet means transport layer where things operate at the TCP and UDP and all of that. But this is just the types of packet filtering firewalls happen at each single layer, and it uses either an IP address, a TCP, and all those different characteristics are available. As you can see from the diagram, we have the firewall itself as an appliance, and everything going to the left to the untrusted network is considered pretty much unrestricted packet data packet, so things can come out of the network and go out easily. However, everything coming in from the network must be filtered. That's why we have the red arrow pointing right, and every single data that goes in must be filtered. So we refer to that as the filtered data packets. Every traffic that is configured not to go in, that means it's blocked, will be blocked and then it will have to be dropped. We have, and in order to allow or block it, you just enforce something we call ACL, that the access control list or rules within the firewall to specify that yes, allow this type of traffic and no, do not allow this type of traffic. We have the types of packet filter firewalls, and one of them is the pretty much stateful firewall, and then we have the stateless firewall. The stateful firewall can watch traffic streams from end to end. When we say from end to end, it means from one end of the traffic that could be from a device, like maybe from a router to a router, and they are aware of the communication path and can implement different various IPsec functions by maybe using encryption or tunneling and all of those things that secure traffic at the IP layer. We also have the stateless. The stateless firewalls watch network traffic and pretty much restrict or block packets based on the source and destination address. So they look at, you configure the access control list, define all the IP addresses you want in and out, and then they look into that. And if it is to be allowed, it goes in. If it is not, it doesn't go out. It's also referred to as the static firewall. Now, at the application layer, uh, firewall, also referred to as a, well, we have something called an application layer proxy firewall as well. But basically, what happens is it is an additional device that serves as a proxy, and it has some sort of a capability to filter traffic at the application layer. So rather than just specify the type of IP address that needs to go in and out, you can also define the type of application that can go in and out based on the application protocol. An example would be HTTP, which means you will not be able to connect to the internet if you're coming from inside, or you will not be able to do anything that happens, not the internet, but rather the web browser. Anything that uses a web browser, you will not be able to use it because the web browser uses HTTP. However, if you have HTTPS, that might go through if you allow HTTPS and block HTTP. Remember, all of these have different port numbers. If you don't know what a port number is, again, refer back to IT 520, but HTTPS uses 443 and HTTP uses TCP port 80. We have the FTP. Ideally, you shouldn't be using FTP because it is not secured. That's the file transfer protocol. And a good implementation is to have actually a rule that denies everything. So everything should be denied, our IP addressing or whatsoever, and then you should only allow by exception. Next, we have the MAC layer firewalls. What basically happens here is just that it blocks the firewalls at the MAC layer. That is at the layer 2, the data layer, and then the layer 2 of the OSI model. And then we have the hybrid firewalls, which combine either the packet filter, application filter, or the MAC layer firewalls. Then we also have different architectures for firewalls. One of them is some of them include the three major ones include single bash and host, screen host architecture, and also a screen subnet. We'll go into these in depth, but every single organization should actually determine which implementation is best for them. And a good way to make that decision includes looking at these three factors, that is, the objective of the network, the organization ability to pretty much develop and implement the architecture, and also the budget available for the function. Now, as we go into the different types of the architecture, you will see that we have the Bastion host, which is the top left, and the Bastion host is commonly referred to pretty much as a sacrificial host, which is basically just a host that is really not secured. You just sacrifice it to do a certain um, function, which is to defend the network perimeter. And a Bastion hosts usually have two network interface cards where one is connected to the external network and the other one is connected to the internal network. As you can see here, we have the dual home Bastion host that is with two network interface card, and one is connected to the external network, the other is connected to the internal network. We This type of implementation usually makes use of network address translation, that's NAT, and it creates another barrier from intrusion from external attackers. Second, we have the screen host, as you can see on the right. Screen host usually combines packet filter router with a separate dedicated firewall, such as an application proxy server. As you can see here, we did touch on what an application proxy server is, but as you can see here on the diagram, we do have the application proxy server. I don't know why, it seems like my screen is really misbehaving, going back and forth. But if you can follow it on figure 2, you'll see that we have the application layer firewall. And yep. Now with the with the screen host, it allows router to pretty much pre-screen packets to minimize the traffic and load on the internal proxy because it might get overwhelmed if there is a lot going on. And this is also a good implementation to kind of limit attacks like distributed denial of service. It also requires an external attack to pretty much compromise two separate systems, that is the application firewall and the packet filtering firewall, before the attack can really be the attacker can actually access the internal data. The last one we have is, as you can see bottom left, that's the screen subnet. The screen subnet usually combines packet filter sorry about that. The screen subnet is usually the dominant architecture we use today, and it commonly consists of two or more internal version hosts behind the packet filtering device, and with each of its hosts protecting the trusted network. And connections from outside or untrusted network routed through are usually routed through the external filtering router or firewall, and also the connections from outside are routed into and out of routing firewall to separate network segment known as the DMZ. The DMZ is the demilitarized zone that is considered part of the network that should be exposed outside. And part of a DMZ implementation is, say an organization has a website, a customer website that doesn't have any data other than informational data, so they do not really care about that. They will put it on the DMZ side of the network because it doesn't really need anything to be connected on the internet. It doesn't really need anything to be connected with the internal network. There, from this implementation, they will have all their security devices after the DMZ and right at the entrance of the internal network. Uh, screen subnet, uh, the screen subnet implementation architecture usually protects two functions. That is, one, it protects the DMZ system and information from outside threat, and also it protects the internal network by limiting how many external connections can gain access to the internal system. Some pretty much how we select, configure, and manage firewalls. When selecting firewalls, it is always a good consideration to pretty much consider what firewall technology offers right what firewall technology offers the right balance between protection and cost for the organizational need, as well as which features are included in the base price of the firewall, as well as which ones are not. If you're buying the appliance, you should know its functionality in details, as well as if it's going to serve your needs. Also, ease of setup and configuration is really important when deciding on a type of firewall on pretty much any device, that because it determines how accessible staff, technicians, and people who can configure the firewall. You do not want to buy a device that is really hard to configure. Then another thing to pay attention to is actually, can the device adapt to the organization growing network or needs. Uh, Today, the firewall might be meant to just protect 10 computers, and then tomorrow the organization might grow to 100 devices. And is the device going to really handle that? Now, one should also pay attention to the cost and the needs. The idea of just buying a device for tomorrow, if you're not certain that your organization is going to grow, could be considered as a waste, especially with the way technology is changing really fast. There are some good practices when managing and configuring firewalls. Some of it include deny all, allow by exception, which is to deny every single type of traffic and only allow the ones that you really need. Blocking well-known common ports. Well-known common ports are the pretty much common ports that are really well known. The idea of leaving them open is always advised against. One includes like port 80 on TCP, port 22, which is being used by Telnet. You should not use 22, you should always use 23 for connections, and all those basic ones. ICMP, that is the same protocol that is being used to ping, should be denied. You do not want people from outside pinging your internal systems. Telnet access should be blocked because Telnet is not secured. People should use SSH. And each device should have its unique set of rules. That is, if you have two devices, you should not configure the same type of access control list unless they are meant to serve exactly the same thing. So if they are doing something separate duties, then each one should be configured according to its duties. Also, a firewall device should actually never be accessible from the public network. That is, people from outside should not be able to route into your firewall and be able to play with it. That means they can change the configurations. And firewall rules, pretty much they are kind of important in terms of deciding how the rules should be. Ideally, a lot of organizations really sit down and flush out all the services that they need, block everything, and just allow those things and just allow the services that they need to be added to the firewall rules. We refer to those firewall rules as ACL, that is access control list. Some protections for connections, I guess, has to do with content filters and remote connections. Um, Content filters are basically software filters, not a firewall, but they allow administrators to restrict content access from within a network. An example of this has to do with maybe blocking access to YouTube or blocking access to Spotify or things like that. They just block a type of content. A type of content could be music, could be movies, could be pictures, could be stories, blocking Instagram stories and Snapchat stories, and things like that. Most common content filters restrict users from accessing non-business websites or deny incoming spam. Then there's also the remote connections. Remote connection has to do with the ability to access resources from a different location than the main network itself. So it could be a user at home or an employee at home trying to access their company resources. That means they are not directly connected to the network, they are connected to their home network, and there is a need to really protect that connection. Some of the implementations to protect remote connections includes having a VPN in place. It's becoming um, the most popular due to the spread of internet, and there used to be other ones which we are going to definitely look into. So with remote access entirely, there is the dial-up, which has to do with unsecured dial-up connection points, and that usually represents a substantial exposure of attack because it is really not secured. Dial-ups use the regular telephone lines to establish their connections, and they are known to be really unsecured when it comes to exchange of information. Attackers can use a device called a word dialer to locate connection points, and which means if they can find a connection point, they can be able to connect either their phone or devices to pick up connections as well as tap into the network. And it's part of an attack called man in the middle attack. There are some authentication process with remote connections that needs to be not only remote connections, but when we talk about the authentication, there are some mechanisms in place and technologies in place that really improve authentication process. First, we have the radius, we have the tag, TACACS, the diameter, we have CHAP, Kerberos, Sesame. All of these are on authentication process. With Radius, the system that authenticate user credentials for those trying to access an organization network via dial-up are being used. Also, it centralizes, that is, Radius centralizes responsibility for user authentication in a central Radius server. So there is a dedicated server that is meant to authenticate before access to the resources happen. With diameter, it's pretty much an emerging alternative from radius. Due to limitations on radius, diameter is the new improvement. There is the TACACS, also known as the Terminal Access Controller Access Control System, and it validates user credentials also at a centralized server like radius. So it means there has to be a server and a client configuration in place. We also have the CHAP, that is the challenge hand authentication protocol, which is more like similar to the PAP, that is password authentication protocol. It's also a client server configuration authentication. We have Kerberos. Kerberos is really popular. It provides secure third-party authentication rather than just the client server. It provides a third-party authentication. It also actually uses asymmetric key encryption to pretty much validate users to various network resources or various system resources. And it also keeps a database of, because it uses this asymmetric key, if you remember from our cryptography class, we spoke about symmetric and asymmetric algorithms, encryption algorithms. So Kerberos uses symmetric, and because it uses symmetric, there has to be a private key, and so it has a database that contains all the private keys of the client and servers systems. That database is really, really important and needs to be protected, because if an attacker were able to get access to that database, it means they have access to all the private keys. And usually authentication with Kerberos can consist of three aspects. That is, there has to be an authentication server, there has to be a key distribution center, and then some sort of ticket granting service known as TGS. We'll look in depth on how Kerberos function. Then we have the Sesame, which is the secure European system for application in multi-vendor environment. It's very similar to Kerberos, and you, same like Kerberos, the user first need to be authenticated to a server and then they receive a token and then the token is presented to privilege attribute server basically as proof of identity to gain privilege attribute certificate. Now to look at Radius in depth, or rather to look at Radius high level, um, this is how a radius configuration is. So let's assume there is a remote worker who dials into a network access server. They go in there and submit their username and password. Then the network access server will now pass the username on server to the to Radius, and then Radius will either approve or reject. That is, Radius will authorize, and then the network access server will authorize the remote worker. The lapse in this is that you have to access pretty much the NAS before getting to the Radius server. Ideally, the Radius server should authenticate you before accessing the NAS. Um, Kerberos. This is Kerberos, and at a high level, how it works is a user will pretty much log onto their machine, and then the client machine will encrypt a password to create a key for the client, and that client machine will then send a request to the authentication server, and the authentication server will come back um, with a ticket granting session. That is a session key for future communication between the client system and the TGS. The TGS is the server that pretty much the client is going to access. As you can see high level, and to pretty much elaborate this in real life, this is me borrowing knowledge from Kelly Handahan. And think of going to maybe an amusement park where you go there, you have to present your username. That will be your maybe national ID or maybe your driver's license, and that will be your identifier. And after everything, you present that, you then get access into the museum. Let's say it's Six Flags, and you go in there. Now, that only gives you access into the environment, but it doesn't allow you to get a ride. For you to be able to get a ride, you also have to present your ticket that was issued to you after you authenticate yourself. That ticket will determine if you are allowed to maybe use the flash, that is to quickly go through the line, or you have to stand behind the line or whatsoever. Ideally, that is how Kerberos works if we were to think of it as a Kerberos being a system in place to authenticate users going to Six Flags. Next, we have the VPNs, and VPNs is basically a private and secure network connection between systems that uses the data communication capability of an unsecured and public network. VPNs are commonly used to extend security of an organization internal network connection to remote locations, basically beyond the trusted network. The trusted network will be the internal network of an organization. The minute an employee goes out of that, goes home, it means their home connection is not trusted by the organization. Therefore, for the employee to be able to access that organization, there has to be some sort of a trust in place. VPN will be the virtual private network that pretty much provides that secure network connection between the home network and the trusted office network. There are three VPN technologies. There is the trusted VPN, which uses leased circuits from service providers and conducts pretty much packet switching over these leased circuits, kind of like how you go and subscribe to a VPN service that is provided by some sort of a service provider. You pay them, you do not do any implementation, you just connect to it, and then that's it. Then we have the secure VPN, which uses security protocols. Same thing with the trusted VPN, but in this case, you are responsible for setting it up and everything. But the secure VPN uses security protocols to encrypt traffic transmitted across unsecured public networks like the internet, basically. And then we have a hybrid. which is a combination of the two. That is, it provides encrypted transmission, that is secure VPN over some or all of trusted VPN network. Now, a VPN, at least for every VPN, it must every VPN implementation should be able to pretty much address these three things. That it should be able to encapsulate incoming and outgoing data. If you do not understand what encapsulation is, then you should definitely refer to IT 520. But basically, it is the ability to merge headers as well as data that are flowing through um, the TCP/IP model or the OSI models by pretty much from layer 1 to layer 2 to layer 3 as well as layer 4 all the way to layer 7. That is part of the encapsulations and fragmentations that happen. So every VPN should be able to encapsulate incoming and outgoing data. Therefore, therefore, that will provide a native protocol of the client, I guess. Client should be embedded within the frames of a protocol and should be able to be routed over a public network as well as to be usable by the um, server network environment. Also, the VPN should be able to encrypt incoming and outgoing data to keep the data content private while in transit over the network. Also refer to data in different stages, that is data in use, data in transit, and um, data at rest. We touch on that as it relates to cryptography and encryption. So a VPN must be able to provide some sort of a data in transit protection. That is, as the data is traveling from one point to another, it should be secured. Also, a VPN implementation should provide some sort of an authentication mechanism. That is, it should be able to authenticate remote computers and at least. So from if the VPN implementation is coming from the organization, the VPN should be able to authenticate the computer that is at the remote end, that is the home location. And as well as the remote user should be authenticated. So the authentication and the subsequent authorization should go hand in hand, and it should be for the user to be able to perform a specific function. The VPN should maintain authorization of the remote system. There are two pretty much modes when it comes to VPN as well. VPN implementation, we have the transport mode and we have the tunnel mode. The transport mode is basically the one on the top right, that is just from end to end, as within the transport, the data should be secured and the VPN should be established and throughout the entire network. And then we have the tunnel mode, which is rather than go over the untrusted network directly, meaning the data is being secured over untrusted network. No, it creates a tunnel, a dedicated tunnel between one of the network to another network. And normally the tunnels are created between either firewalls, routers, or tunnel devices, and it creates a path that that is not exposed to the public. So basically, nobody can use that path. Only the path is just between one network to another. And this brings us to the end of this chapter. We were able to pretty much discuss what access control is, as well as the approach for that access controls relies on, that including identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. We also discussed what a firewall is, as well as how a firewall prevents different types of connection from moving in and out of a network. We also talk about untrusted network and the inside network, that's the intranet, as well as the trusted network. Um, we touch on firewalls, the different ways firewalls are being categorized, including packet filtering, medium access control, media access control layers, that's based on the MAC addresses, and as well as the application gateways, that's the application firewall, as well as proxy filtering. and the hybrid firewalls, which include the implementation of two or the three. We talk about the packet filtering firewalls and how they are implemented using static filtering, then unstateful filtering, dynamic filtering, including both static and stateful in place. We also discuss the three common architectural implementations of a firewall, including single version host, screen host, and screen subnet. We talk about connections, that is dial-up connection, as well as their different protections, including Cabarrus, TCAC, CS authorizations method. We talk about Sesame and including CHAP as well. We also talk about virtual private network and how they are used to enable remote access from untrusted networks to trusted networks. Thank you very much, and I would see you as well. I guess I will cover the next chapter next week.